One of the more rare myths about Soviet science is about the two-headed dog, which is indeed real. That's the thing people want to know first, and the answer is yes. Vladimir Demikhov grafted the head, shoulders, and front legs of a smaller dog onto the neck of our larger one, and the animal survived. The puppy head could see, it could hear, it lapped at milk when a bowl was offered, it responded to stimuli. It existed briefly as something that should not have been able to exist. Demikhov filmed it, and the footage survived. We'll come back to the two-headed dog, but that's not actually what this is about. Demikhov was born in 1916 in a small farming settlement in the Volgograd region, the son of a peasant who would be killed in the Russian Civil War when Demikhov was 3 years old. His mother raised 3 children alone, with limited education of her own, and managed to give all of them a good one. Demikhov arrived in Moscow in 1934 to study biology, and by 1937, while still a student, had built the world's first mechanical cardiac assist device and successfully implanted it in a dog. The device was too large to sustain the dog for more than a few hours. The concept was 60 years ahead of the surgical infrastructure that would eventually make it viable. Demikhov published a description in his university student newspaper and presented it at a scientific conference, graduated, and went to war. He served as a military pathologist at Stalingrad and on the Eastern Front, a man who had built an artificial heart, now performing autopsies and treating the wounded in one of the most brutal theaters of the most brutal war in human history. There's a detail from this period that tells you something essential about who he was. Soldiers at the front sometimes inflicted wounds on themselves to escape combat. Under Stalin's orders, this was a capital offense. Discovery meant execution. Demikhov falsified the reports. He altered the documentation to protect men he had determined were not enemies of the state, but humans who had reached the limit of what human beings could bear. He did this at considerable personal risk, and didn't stop doing it. After the war, he came back to Moscow and went to work. What he did between 1946 and 55, the decade before the two-headed dog, was among the most consequential surgical work of the 20th century, conducted in conditions that Christiaan Barnard, when he finally visited the laboratory, described as frighteningly primitive. In 1946, he performed the first surgical intrathoracic heart-lung transplant in a warm-blooded animal. The dog survived 9.5 hours, long enough to establish that the procedure was biologically possible, which is what the entire subsequent history of cardiac surgery required someone to establish first. In 1947, he performed the first lung transplant. In 1951, the first correctly positioned orthotopic heart transplant in a dog, meaning the heart was in the right place in the chest, rather than offset, the way it needed to be for the procedure to eventually work in humans. One of the dogs that received a heart transplant in 1953 to survive for 7 years after. In 1953, 7 years from a transplanted heart, in a laboratory that looked to Western eyes like it shouldn't have been producing those results. He was also working on coronary bypass, the technique of rerouting blood flow around a blocked coronary artery that would eventually become one of the most performed surgical procedures in the world. He developed the technique in dogs. He demonstrated it worked. He published. He waited for the Soviet medical establishment to notice. They convened a review committee and declared his work unethical. The Ministry of Health's position in the early 1950s was that Demikhov's experiments, the transplantations, the bypass work, the sustained survival of animals with foreign hearts, constituted research that should not be continued. The specific nature of the ethical objection varied depending on which committee member was speaking, but the practical effect was in order to cease. Demikhov was sheltered. Alexander Vishnevsky, director of the Institute of Surgery and surgeon in charge of the Soviet Armed Forces, had enough institutional independence from the Ministry of Health to simply decline to enforce the order. He kept Demikhov working, which isn't a small thing. It meant that the most important surgical researcher in the USSR was operating under the protection of a military patron against the explicit directive of the Civilian Health Authority, in a country where those kinds of conflicts did not resolve in favor of science. Demikhov moved institutions periodically, from the Institute of Surgery to the Sechenov Medical Institute, to the Sklifosovsky Emergency Institute, where he would work from 1960 to 1986. They weren't promotions exactly, they were more lateral shuffles of a man whose work kept being tolerated rather than supported, protected by individuals. During the entire period, the most productive surgical research career of any Soviet scientist in the post-war era, Demikhov lived with his wife, his daughter, and his mother in 2 rooms. 2 rooms for 4 people in Moscow for nearly 2 decades. He kept experimental dogs at home when their post-operative condition required close monitoring. Because he had no other option, because the laboratory he was changing the history of medicine in did not have adequate overnight observation capacity. And so the dogs came home. In 1954, Demikhov performed the first successful head transplant, or more accurately, the first successful grafting of one dog onto another. He would perform the procedure over 20 times between 1954 and the early 1960s, refining the technique each time. The longest any of the animals survived was 29 days. The surgery itself was a masterwork of vascular technique, the kind of precise anastomosis work, the joining of blood vessels. That was the foundation of everything else Demikhov had been doing for a decade. The head transplant was not a departure from his cardiac research. It was an application of the same skills to a more visible demonstration. And that visibility was the point. Here's what actually happened when the footage was published. The news spread faster than any of Demikhov's previous work. Newspapers everywhere covered it. There were ethical arguments, philosophical arguments, theological arguments. Christiaan Barnard, who had not yet visited Demikhov's laboratory, but had read a report of the head transplant in a Cape Town newspaper, was sufficiently irritated by it that he performed his own dog head transplant the same afternoon, telling colleagues that anything those Russians can do, we can do too. Which is to say, the grotesque experiment worked as a provocation in ways the serious work had not. The cardiac transplants and the bypass techniques in the 7-year survival dog had traveled slowly through academic channels. The two-headed dog traveled everywhere, immediately, and brought the serious work with it. When Barnard came to Moscow in 1960, partly because of the head transplant publicity, partly because Demikhov's monograph on organ transplantation had been published that year and was making its way through the community, he came to a laboratory that had been doing foundational work for 14 years, and had finally, through the most confrontational demonstration Demikhov could devise, made the world pay attention. The laboratories and operating theaters were frighteningly primitive, Barnard said afterward, but the extraordinary Demikhov encouraged him to dream. His monograph, Experimental Transplantation of Vital Organs, was published in Moscow in 1960. It was the first book ever written on the subject of intrathoracic transplantation. It was translated into English and published in New York in 1962, German in 63, Spanish in 67. It became the foundational text of an entire surgical field, the textbook from which a generation of cardiac surgeons learned the techniques that would eventually save millions of lives. The year after the English translation was published, James Hardy performed the first human lung transplant. The techniques Hardy used traced directly to Demikhov's animal work. In 1967, Barnard performed the first human heart transplant. The patient, Louis Washkansky, a 54-year-old grocer with irreversible heart disease, survived 18 days before dying of pneumonia brought on by the immunosuppressant drugs. Barnard was celebrated globally. Time magazine, television appearances, the cover of every newspaper. The man who had transplanted a human heart for the first time in history. Barnard said in the same year that if there was a father of heart and lung transplantation, Demikhov certainly deserved the title. He was in Moscow, at the Sklivosovsky Institute, in a lab that Western visitors continue to describe as inadequate. The Soviet state's relationship with Demikhov's work was, and this is the argument the two-headed dog obscures, not one of suppression exactly. It was something more complicated, and in some ways more corrosive. The state used the two-headed dog. The 1960 documentary, The Two-Headed Transplant, presented the experiment as evidence of Soviet scientific supremacy. Stalinist propaganda had advertised the head transplant as proof of the superiority of Soviet science. The grotesque demonstration that Demikhov had used to force the world's attention onto his serious work was appropriated by the state as a propaganda trophy, while the serious work continued to be underfunded, undersupported, conducted in inadequate facilities by a man living in 2 rooms with his family and his experimental dogs. The system that claimed credit for the spectacle did not fund the science. It celebrated the product of the work while declining to invest in the conditions that produced it. This is a specific kind of relationship with genius that is different from persecution. Demikhov was not arrested, not sent to the gulag, not purged. He was tolerated, protected by individuals when the bureaucracy threatened to stop him, moved between areas, left in inadequate conditions, given just enough support to continue, and not to flourish. The Lysenko years, the period where ideologically correct pseudoscience was enforced at the expense of real biology, overlapped almost exactly with Demikhov's most productive decade. While Lysenko's theories were suppressing genetics research across the USSR, Demikhov was quietly performing cardiac surgery that was 15 years ahead of anything the West was doing, in a lab with inadequate equipment, protected from the Ministry of Health by a military surgeon who had enough independence. The Soviet system produced both of these situations simultaneously in the same country, in the same decade. It could destroy genuine science with one hand and shelter it with the other. There is a detail about Barnard's second visit to the lab in 1963 that the account usually skips past. Barnard came back. 4 years after the first visit, with the English translation of Demikhov's monograph now circulating in the community, Barnard returned to Moscow and spent time again in the lab that had frightened him with its primitiveness and inspired him with its results. He was by this point the head of cardiothoracic surgery at the University of Cape Town. He was 4 years away from the operation that would make him famous. He came back to the man who had shown him it was possible and spent more time learning from him in conditions that the Soviet medical establishment had been trying to shut down for a decade. Demikhov told him, "Nothing is impossible. Nothing." 4 years later, in an operating theater at Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town, Barnard transplanted a human heart for the first time. He called Demikhov afterward, or so the legend has it, and enough of the people close to both men have confirmed versions of it that the legend is at minimum directionally accurate to tell him what he had done. Demikhov did not receive a comparable call from the Soviets. He worked at the Skivoskovsky Institute until 1986, 70 years old, 40 years after the first cardiac transplant in a living animal, 20 years after Barnard had built a global career on foundations Demikhov had laid. He was still in the same area, the same building, the same inadequate conditions. Unremarkable. In 1988, he received the Hero of Socialist Labor, the Soviet Union's highest civilian honor. It was 2 years before it ceased to exist. He was 72 years old. In 1998, the year he died of an aneurysm in his small apartment on the outskirts of Moscow, Russia awarded him the Order of Merit for the Fatherland, 3rd class. It was the first time the Russian state had formally acknowledged the true value of what he had done. He received it shortly before he died, 3rd class, for the man Barnard had called the father of heart and lung transplantation. The cardiac bypass procedure he developed in dogs in the early 50s is now performed over 1 million times a year globally. Every one of these operations traces a line back to a lab in Moscow that Western visitors described as primitive, run by a man who kept his dogs at home because it didn't have overnight facilities, protected from shutdown by a military surgeon. So yes, the two-headed dog is real, but it's not the story, and it's not what you should focus on.